Welcome to the virtual event addressing the crypto question, produced by the P3 Network. We are a convening force that brings private industry with country-level engagements and the public sector together. Thank you again to our sponsors who help make this possible. This webinar's focus is particularly on national security, and the series is to provide thought leadership for Congress and the Crypto Technology Advisory Group, which the P3 Network's chairman is leading. I am your host, Adrian Ewell, where I am one of the founders of the P3 Network. The series has leaders from both the public and private sector. Today's webinar, we have Jeremy Sheridan, former Assistant Director of Investigations at the Secret Service. Hello, Jeremy, how are you doing?
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
Great. And Kathy Kraninger, former Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Hello, Kathy, how are you?
Hello, Adrian and everyone. Fantastic to be with you today.
And we have, thank you, Kathy. And we have Scott Richards. He has an extensive knowledge in organized crime and terrorism and has been an advisor in numerous governments and on transnational threats in networks in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you for having me here, and it's a pleasure to meet everybody to discuss these topics today.
Thank you, Scott. And of course, the Honorable Congressman Pete Sessions, who has provided over 2 decades of leadership in Congress supporting a stronger America, both in technological innovation and national security. Particularly, the Congressman has led and unified the discussion around digital assets and blockchain technology. He is a leader of the Crypto Technical Working Group and a supporter of the P3 Network. Hello, Congressman.
Hope you're good today. This is a very exciting time and one that hits at the essence or the basis of the integrity of the system and the need for people to feel like this is not just a good investment, but a safe investment. Delighted we're doing this.
Yes, definitely. And just to give some context to everybody, we have a lot of things going on, national security and blockchain. There's 70 plus bills in Congress being introduced about crypto. What is going on in Congress? What is going on in the halls, the chambers of Congress right now?
Thank you. The essence of the discussion on the Hill is one that still centers itself around conversation that really took place in the form of legislation in the Senate. As we know that was kind of the first shot out there of looking at not just crypto, but how it related to the marketplace. The primary drivers of this, as we all know and understand, is trying to make sure that the embedded opportunities that people have to invest will become ubiquitous across the system, across the opportunity for people, wherever they live, wherever they work, to be able to have a secure investment, one that is interchangeable and one that has a healthy opportunity for growth and security and safety. So the discussions have been around activities, not just in Houston, not just Miami, but really in webinars and conversations all around the country where people are getting their head around how are we going to ensure that the laws and rules and regulations that are written conform with what we believe will be agency directives that they will be given. And about the last thing we want is to overburden the industry, but we want to make sure that there's a balance with safety and ubiquity in that transaction. So we have not really moved an inch forward. It has been off an agenda that was driven by the majority party, the Democratic Party, by this administration. And then on the administrative side, you have seen where President Biden has given directive to agencies to come up with their thoughts, ideas, and plans, including the Internal Revenue Service, who is going to add 88,000 new employees. So I can bet at least 1 or 2 of those will be focused on how they're going to over-regulate and burden people who do this. But get ready, because that's where the entire marketplace is. So that's just a waterfront, as you talked about, issue up top.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. And as I said, you're a P3 network partner and also a real great support leader of the crypto technical working group, and that's essential for the future of what DeFi and opening up different districts to the opportunities for economic innovation. So thank you again. So Kathy, based on that, what are some of the implications of a nation failing to adopt blockchain technology and innovation in an increasingly multipolar world?
Well, it's a fantastic, wide-ranging question, to be sure, Adrian, and I know we'll have a lot of opportunity to discuss it. But let me start at least from the first overall point, which is the opportunity and what really blockchain technology represents. It's the next iteration of the internet, and it really is going to touch everyone's lives in myriad ways. It takes you back to really the early 1990s, before we all had cell phones in our hands, before there was e-commerce, and then certainly the dynamics of a multipolar world. You get to, where is the manufacturing base for this technology? Where is the human capital around this technology? And certainly with the internet, the US led. And that was fundamental to, the world we find ourselves in today. Look, from a regulatory standpoint, we have not solved all of the issues by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly, there are concerns about social media and even the engineering of information by nation state actors, by the way, to influence election outcomes in different countries. So, the implications of the technology are substantial to national security interests. And we haven't solved all of them with the internet. But we also recognize that this was not something that we should be seeking to stop. So the US has to lead. And I would say that the Biden administration and the executive order the president issued laid out the interests, the national interests of the United States very clearly. It was recognizing that there are interdependencies here and an interplay between US competitiveness, our economic security and interests, the opportunities that we're providing for our own citizens and residents in the United States to really address some issues around financial inclusion, while at the same time really helping us be a continued source of innovation in the world. So I guess I would frame it out from that standpoint. Absolutely, there are risks. I can tell you the industry is really seeking to tackle those risks. That's what the company that I work for now, Solidus Labs, really does. It's about risk monitoring in these markets. But bottom line is that the U.S. really does need to lead, think carefully, and support continued innovation in this space.
And does anyone else have any follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about national security, as Kathy touched on, it's a lot of people will immediately think of threat when we talk about national security. But what we're really talking about is the whole holistic description of a nation state, economy, infrastructure, everything else like that. And so when we look at what it means to have transparent and fair activity around cryptocurrencies or the use of blockchain and supply chains, we consider that from the perspective of competitiveness and openness. When we look in the context of a multipolar world, other hostile nation states or adversarial nation states is probably a fairer term, whether that be Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, these states can look at the perspective of sanctions and other activities are a threat to their national security from a perspective point of view. And so when we look at what blockchain can mean in terms of the ability for these organizations to create a digital currency, whether it's a digital RMB, to be able to evade sanctions, which is the primary tool of pressure to create conformity. And so in this kind of context, you need to look at what the technology means to innovation for other states that may not be friendly to the international order that we've had since World War II.
Great.
Adrian, I would also add, I think the narrative around digital assets, cryptocurrency as a whole, takes a very negative perspective. And if you look at the advantages, as have been discussed by Scott and Kathy, in a lot of areas, but the advantages on the security front that we saw within the Secret Service in my previous role about creating increased investigative opportunities, increased interagency coordination, improved resourcing, additional authorities. Federal judges call this technology a source for probable cause beyond compare. And what this affords in terms of the ability to have actually more secure networks, more trusted interaction and cross-country communication and visibility into financing and financial systems is not, in my opinion, not discussed enough.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And
right, I think what Jeremy adds there is, and I've taken the perspective of from a kind of a threat analyst point of view, is what are the threats, what are the meanings to national security? And he's absolutely right that the immutable nature of the chain, that data is decentralized, it's impervious to single point data attacks, and that it can be interrogated and audited. And then we need to sort of look at what immutable information means for people's lives. What does that mean for your healthcare? What does that mean for your insurance? What does that mean when you have an absolute persistent record of everything that you've done sort of on a blockchain, which is kind of another layer of the holistic health of a society? And then we also need to look at how threat actors could operate around in creating data sources that use zero knowledge proofs between certain actors. So I know that I am that you're a sanctioned bank or whatever else. You're dealing with another party. You have a ledger, but instead of exchanging information, you use programmatic tools to further enhance your anonymity. So there's kind of an enormous sort of spectrum about what an immutable tool can do, how this can improve our lives, but also because we're relying on programs, the programs can be built with very specific intent and purpose. So it's it's an incredibly fascinating period that we're going into, that we need to be radically prepared for new paradigms for detection evasion, because again, to what Jeremy says is law enforcement is reliant on the ability to detect organized crime or actors that are seeking to evade sanctions or obfuscate corporate ownership, are seeking to avoid detection by the kinds of people that Jeremy worked with previously, particularly when talking about money-related crimes.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that the role of Congress is to be up in line with the paradigm shift, go towards the new technologies that are going to create the proper application of the technology, and that's what we're looking for right now from the crypto technical work.
From a kind of a Congress side or a legislative side, a law enforcement side, to detection. I mean, regulation is a form of protection so that everybody obeys the rules, and that people have safety with investments, transparency, notability. But these are criteria that we set upon our society, and then we hope others follow that are allied or have similar economies. But when you look at what you require in terms of innovative thought paradigms and thinking, there's so much expertise in cryptography involved in these things, so much expertise going into concepts such as, let's say, zero knowledge proofs and SNARKs that are designed to protect people's personal information against what could happen, using the healthcare example, or so that information can be exchanged without exposing all the private data to third parties and so on and so forth. But you can transport those same tool sets into other theater. So the necessity for innovative red cell-like thinking to how and what to look for would be incredibly important to maintaining stability and security.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, stability increases the security of a country.
Absolutely.
Scott, based on what you were just diverting into something else, going back on national security, what are some of your experience in transnational threats and crime? How would a terrorist organization or an insurgent group possibly utilize unregulated digital currencies to funnel their initiatives?
I mean, that has occurred. I mean, it was occurred, and there was a case by DOJ relatively recently where they captured 300 accounts related to Hamas's military wing, Al Qaeda, and ISIS. It's generally sort of said that this is occurring at a fairly low level. And that's where I come back to the notion of detection. Because when we're talking about activity taking place in Discord channels, Telegram channels, fundraising by ISIS in Telegram channels, or even then when you get sophisticated actors, and to use the example of ISIS, and this is something that a lot of people don't appreciate enough, is that threat organizations trade tactics, techniques, and procedures. They innovate, and they constantly have to innovate again back to detection. And so, ISIS has longstanding relationships with the 'Ndrangheta, the large Calabrian Italian mafia, moving enormous amounts of narcotic. We're talking busts of 26 million Captagon pills, tramadol. And so as these organizations come into organizations that professionally money launder, 'Ndrangheta being one of the largest money laundering mafias in the world, that is their core specialization, they will share techniques, they will trade. And you also have to remember that when we talk about Islamic extremism, we're talking about a very specific set of a small number of people who've known each other for the past 30, 40 years. They communicate regularly, they exchange regularly, they host regularly. And so it's there, it's happening. I mean, there are particular places that I would look for it, like the Hawala systems, which is, it's like an illegal Western Union. And so what cryptocurrency would do for Hawala is remove the necessity for large cash presence. Instead of having to have, $50,000, $100,000, $1 million in one country and $1 million on the other, where they trade ownership, you could just trade ownership of crypto. Much less risk of detection. You don't have to house and store the cash in the same kind of way. And so when you get that intersect, and to use the example, if you wanted to move your money from, one theater to another, say to Afghanistan, you can't go to a weapons market in Peshawar and buy an RPG-7, but you could send your Bitcoin to somebody who would then cash out, and then you'd get your weapons buyer. And you'd have much less exposure. That transaction is instantaneous. So your ability, unless you had, wallet identification of suspect wallets, you wouldn't see it happening until after it was done.
Interesting. Kathy, you might have had some experience with Consumer Protection Bureau with unregulated activities. What could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, Adrian, thank you. And I certainly take to heart what Scott and Amal said. I started my career on 9/11 at the Department of Transportation. So I was involved in really the apparatus that we built up after 9/11 with respect to terrorism and countering terrorism, and certainly countering the financing of terrorists, as well as obviously you noted the consumer protection perspective that I bring after my career in financial regulation. So looking at these things holistically, the one thing I would note is that there is illicit activity, but we have not solved the illicit activity problem in traditional finance. So the notion that I don't want to leave listeners with the idea that it is rampant and uncontrolled in crypto markets. There is a whole set of market participants who are engaged in responsible activity. Certainly, I've got Jeremy on here with me as a former law enforcement officer and someone who's really helping to build that infrastructure in the ecosystem, and myself as well. So the vast majority of the activity, just as it is in traditional finance, is very much legal activity of people just seeking to move their money and seeking to build wealth. Addressing scams, addressing frauds, and addressing money laundering activity, criminal activity is something that is critically important. Crypto being a newer technology that people don't fully understand, particularly your mainstream consumers. Definitely a lot more education that needs to happen here. One of my mantras at the CFPB was really focusing on prevention. And the only way to protect people, frankly, in many respects, is to educate them and give them the tools around investing in general. And I think there are absolutely protections that need to be put in place and enforcement, but all of that is after the fact. And so the best way to protect consumers on the front end is educating them. And then certainly important is policing the marketplace consistent with rules. The US crypto markets are not unregulated. In fact, you've got licensed participants all over at the state level with respect certainly to this illicit activity that we're talking about. We have laws that prohibit fraud. And it's really a matter of, as I said, bringing all of that together. And the piece for Congress, too, as we talked a little bit about, is definitely filling in some gaps that I know the congressman is working to do, and that others in Congress would also weigh in on. And as we think about particularly the spot market dynamics, like the capability our company brings to bear, is requiring market surveillance, requiring those types of activities to reduce the fraud and manipulation. But just didn't want to leave people with the impression that this is an overwhelming issue or one that we are not working to solve, or that we frankly solved the traditional finance either.
Yeah, Congressman, some of the infrastructure, the proper application of the technology for bolstering security and other things like that. In your district yourself, you're also promoting the application in ways that's for the betterment of the district too, right?
Well, in fact, it does. But let's go back to what Kathy really said. What she really said, I believe, is the essence of the issue, and that is that the responsibility is on the person who's the individual owner. And as you know, in traditional finance, it is the institution that has that primary responsibility at some point. Whether it depends whether it's stocks or bonds, it depends whether it's in an FDIC covered account. But the transparencies that are in that system, or the known frauds that come from that system, come from criminal elements that are always lurking at our doors, the wolves that are trying to steal and take. And this is where she is, I think, really dead on with understanding about why we're trying to get ourselves to where we understand not just what's in the account, but the transactions that take place therein. Of all the work we've done, I still don't know how apparent the transactions are. I know they happen in split seconds, but to a netting out perspective, I don't know when that actually happens to where a theft would be seen, a theft would be reported. Whose responsibility is that within this blockchain event cycle? And so there's a lot that we have questions about. There's a lot that I think Kathy, she's really, these three people that you have on here have vast knowledge. They've thought through a lot of these, but I don't see where we're going to tell them how to do things. I think that we'll come up with a responsibility. And so that would be a key question that I'd ask Kathy and others from a government CFPB perspective or from a user perspective, who should be responsible, and where's that netting out process, and who's watching the hen house?
Yeah, definitely. And that actually kind of a good segue, Congressman, into a question I have for Jeremy. Basically, Jeremy, based on your experience working with the Secret Service and stuff like that, and government, what are some of the vulnerabilities to a security breach in the country as a result of these currencies, phishing tactics by foreign adversaries, but also looking at it from the standpoint of how can we utilize these technologies to benefit the country? How can we use them to actually resist those things?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. That's a great question, and I really thank the Congressman, Kathy and Scott, for their leadership on this. I think all outstanding points that lend to this conversation. And to answer the Congressman's previous question, I would provide the answer of efficient regulation. I think there are existing structures within law enforcement, regulatory bodies, rule makers, and others that afford us the opportunities to answer the questions that he and this industry are looking for. In terms of your question about the what and the who, I think it's important to discuss a little bit about the how to frame the context. As Kathy said, important to note in all of this that the digital asset space, digital finance, cryptocurrency as a whole is not inherently criminal in nature. I've testified in front of Congress and answered that same question. It's not designed for criminality. It's simply a tool to provide financial opportunity. Unfortunately, there are bad actors who use it for criminal activity. But what I saw in the Secret Service and what I see currently in my role in the private sector as the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs in my company at Prime Trust is the crypto asset and traditional financial sectors increasingly converging, which creates new opportunities within a very complex landscape. And that landscape, as Kathy said, has regulatory, and the Congressman said, has regulatory structures in place. But what I see is just an inefficient application of those because it's at the state, the federal, even the international level that creates gaps in enforcement, allowing for criminal opportunity and criminal activity. There's, unfortunately, because of this, not much fear of enforcement from the criminal actor. And there's an inconsistent application of the safeguards that exist within US law related to KYC, AML, and what we're talking about today, combating the financing of terrorism. If you combine that with the maturation of the criminal ecosystem, like Scott discussed, that has grown over time, that we haven't sufficiently suppressed in the public or private sector, a continued inadequacy of cyber defense and cybersecurity systems across the interconnected entire cyber landscape globally, as well as nation state involvement that's been referenced earlier, that doesn't provide extradition, that offers safe haven, and in some cases offers material support to these actors. What you have is an environment of huge opportunity. And what will eventually happen, in my opinion, is an expansion beyond the financial sector to broader objectives that have kinetic effects, more physical results. The former secretary that I worked for used to call it killware as opposed to ransomware, and attack vectors that will focus on financial sectors, but other sectors as a whole. But I do want to address the question about the what and the how. I think that's important. What we're seeing in terms of targeted structures and sectors is primarily in decentralized spaces, DeFi, decentralized exchanges. And again, important to note that this is the lifeblood and the soul of the digital asset world where I work currently. And very important to have these structures in place, the privacy protection, the decentralized nature of them. The challenge is that because of their open source code that allows criminal actors to, with an unfettered access, hammer on those systems and explore them and for vulnerabilities, and, evaluate the code, as well as a lack of compliance controls due to their decentralized nature. You have non-compliant exchanges that we in the Secret Service took down, BTCE and others, SUX, Chadex, and so forth, that don't have a central administrator with oversight of user accounts, records, identities, or activities, similar to what the Congressman was referring to. And these provide a useful mechanism, not a solely criminal mechanism, but simply a tool that allows laundering of criminal proceeds, crypto asset to crypto asset swaps. They avoid exposures to regulators or law enforcement and allow criminals to evade seizure. Beyond the exchanges and the platforms themselves, we're seeing a lot of criminal activity in bridges and cross-chain crime, bridges that allow interoperability of the entire digital asset financial space, blockchains to be able to communicate with each other, for lack of a better explanation. They're targeted because they often store a ton of value just by nature of that bridge function. We're also seeing, as Scott mentioned, some hacks within communities such as Discord, where there are compromised accounts, account takeovers, where criminals will use these social media accounts to promote fraudulent digital asset activities, primarily NFT projects. Important to note before we move on to the who, as Kathy said, this is still eclipsed massively by a traditional financial product. If you look at the amount of exchanges that have seen funds, seen attacks, $2.6 billion worth of crypto stolen across 46 exchanges, but that's since 2006. Used just by means of comparison, the pandemic fraud that's occurred in this country over the past 2 years alone, that's eclipsed $100 billion. Traditional financial crime, still a major problem in the criminal element that's just using this as a tool, is just really a consequence of this new technology. But lastly, the who, just to address your question, it still is the human element. This continues to be the weakest link. It is the easiest avenue of ingress, the most effective attack vector for the adversary. It's the most vulnerable point of any system, and where criminals are gaining their access and foothold through the traditional means that have been done for decades of phishing, scamming, social engineering, and so forth. I think, to put a term on the most recent exploits we're seeing, pig butchering, I'm sure you've heard in recent times. This is probably the most frequent one just because of the volume of assets and resources available. It's a longer term, more extensive fraud scheme. It's a prolonged exploitation of the target where a relationship is developed that facilitates a higher volume of funds, higher volume of accounts to be targeted and drain, transfer to criminal possession before termination of relationship.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy. And before, I know Scott and Kathy probably have some follow-up to those ideas because they're pretty phenomenal. I just want to let the congressman say a few last words because he has a hard stop, and then we'll do just a follow-up thoughts and last ideas you guys have to share, and we can pass those on to the congressman and the crypto technical working group. Congressman, could you just have a few last words on for us?
I do. And my words really are of how pleased I am that we are engaged in this with the professional talent that you've assembled. This talent comes up with not just questions, but comes up with probable answers. And this is where our technical working group needs to move itself. And it needs to move itself to understanding, as we have seen, the application of not only international characters who have become a play that we talked about, but also the criminal element that is theft and stealing and manipulating. And this is why what we're doing with these professionals who have a lens to the day-to-day activity are so important. So I would say we need to stay after this. This is vitally important because we will need to measure 3 or 4 times and saw once. And we need to saw and decide where we're going to provide not just context to the administration, but real policy around the security of what I think is a great idea and the future for so many people, not just around the globe, but here in the United States, as an asset that's been talked about, but that grows and increases in value with the participation of people in their viewpoint. So very, very pleased to take part in this, and thank you. I'm sorry that I have to go, but I hope that I did well enough to get invited back.
Yes, and Congressman, our last event in Austin was pretty awesome, but I want to invite you down to Medellin, Colombia, November 9th. We're going to have another roundtable.
Yeah, probably may or may not be there, but I will be very interested. And it's the kind of engagement that this crypto brings to the world, and something as my sons have told me, Dad, you have your own, and y'all have done whatever you did to it, and the inflation and everything else. Give us a shot at this, an equal shot, and that's what I believe in. And really want to thank our 3 professionals who are on here. I've asked my staff to make sure I get their information. I have a need to follow up with them, so don't be surprised if we ask for and give you my email information and theirs also. Thank you very much.
Definitely. And there'll be a link in the bio in the video for you guys to see.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Congressman.
Okay, here we go.
And so to follow up on Jeremy, what you were saying and stuff, Scott, I'm sure, and Kathy, and even Amal, I think you're still there too.
There's something I'd like to circle back on between what Kathy and Jeremy both were sort of saying. Kathy talking about the necessity for education, awareness, and everything else like that. And again, to the nature of how low trust environments are able to proliferate in social media. You know, one really good example when you look at when the web came out and people started doing online transactions, fairly quickly a small trusted group of companies come together to enable payment processing. But if you take the concept of something like Trustpilot, and you have a situation where if companies are going to exchange or trade in crypto, they have to have their smart contracts security audited. And so if you go through a kind of self-regulation process, then you can get, which should be a cryptographically signed item, potentially even an NFT, that somebody could embed in their digital content. It says this site has been evaluated by these licensed security auditors, and their contracts are secure, and they have met these governance and compliance standards, which then sets the onus on industry to meet those standards. And so you can visually immediately identify if somebody has gone through compliance and governance. And that to me seems like a very exciting solution.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Scott. if you look at embedded permissions that are being discussed, reg tech, and these types of opportunities that exist within the smart contract structure, and I think it goes in combination. That's the technological approach. It goes with the regulatory government human approach, if you will. That will be a consequence of what's happening with, with Terra, with Celsius, with all these companies that are going through this now massive regulatory review and exposure and assessment. I think what will come out on the other end is both a technologically sound and a policy and political approach that really strengthens the industry and answers a lot of the questions that the congressman and others have looked to in terms of who's responsible, how can we trust, and where's the safe environment.
Yeah, there were so many. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say there are so many issues and threads that it's tough to decide which one to follow. But I'll note that Jeremy kind of went where the congressman was going, and one of the things I wanted to say back to him around, again, who do we hold accountable? I mean, that is the fundamental challenge the regulators are facing, particularly with DeFi. But as we think about the financial regulatory system that we built that gets after intermediaries. The basis of that is actually deposit insurance. That is where the entire system built up from. And there was a good reason for deposit insurance. And obviously so many of the safeguards that the US put into place, in volatile times in, the early 1900s and throughout, the first at least 50 years of the 20th century. So much of that really is where we've gotten today, where people don't bother to read the disclosures they're given because they just assume they're going to be made whole. There is a difference between a deposit that you're making and an investment that you're making. And I think there are some definitional challenges in the crypto space, again, around, is this an investment that you are making, or what is your participation? I can tell you too that many of the consumers that are participating, their reaction is basically, I want to support this space. I like the tech. I'm involved in GameFi. I understand the smart contracts. I actually designed some myself. I mean, so there is a very sophisticated consumer, group here that says, you don't need to protect me. I actually understand what I'm engaged in. You have certainly a group that clearly does not understand and get you back to first principles around understanding investment risk. And if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So, it's hard to segment a lot of the things that are happening in this space because there are different types of consumers. And then the last thing is when you get back to the intermediaries, there are many who just believe fundamentally retail investors should not have access to these types of products and services. And I think that's also a crossroads that we get to because, there is a very real obviously populist dimension to what's happening in this country and across the world that people are saying, no, you're now precluding me from wealth building. You're now precluding me from access to the financial system, just as you have all along. And so we've got a lot of things with respect to culture and law and transparency and trust that are coming together in this space.
Yeah, I think Kathy brings up, that's a huge point, that essentially the market needs to decide and have some say in this, right? I think a lot of it is viewed as either binary or extreme choices of centralization or decentralization, right? Or, crypto, not crypto. There is a spectrum here, and I know that internet analogy is tired and overused, but if you look at, the internet as a whole, surface web of what we see day to day is 4% versus deep web and dark web. All gross oversimplification, but different markets, different entrants, different risks, different consequences, different entire ecosystems in a way. And I think the digital asset space can be the same way. There can be completely decentralized, there can be, the middle ground, or there can be really over-regulated, and market entrants will make that decision for themselves. And there will be risk, consequences, and rewards associated with each. But I don't think we need to treat it as simply a binary mutually exclusive choice that a lot of times the conversation centers around. And there are companies, like Kathy's, like ours, that have self-regulatory, that have fully compliant, that have compliance first regulatory force as a North Star, as a mission set, as a vision and a strategy. that will afford the safety and the security and the opportunity that the congressman referenced and others are looking for.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of interesting things in here, and my mind's kind of jumping around with all of them. One of the things that comes with the internet is fluidity. And so when you have exchanges or whatever else can move from one jurisdiction to another. We see that, for example, with Binance, which is getting criticized over its lack of compliance and governance. And so if the difficulty is when people, well, not really difficult, the choices that consumers make is when they trade with higher risk institutions that don't meet certain compliance standards. Because you can effectively go on the internet and move your cryptos to an exchange anywhere in the world, and ultimately move jurisdiction. And when that comes to enforcement, because it's cross jurisdiction, the legal framework can't follow as quickly. And I think that the reality of needing to have lightweight, efficient regulation is necessary for talent attraction and innovation. It's necessary for creating new models and exploring new spaces. But at the same time, if we look at exotic financial instruments, as we've all talked about, the traditional money markets, there are individuals who specifically design investment packages to be difficult to understand by the SEC. That's fundamentally their job. And so when we talk about crypto, and I believe at this point we still don't have a legal definition even of decentralization. But when we're talking about smart contracts, whichever body is going to lead on regulatory is going to need very sophisticated people to be able to look at smart contracts and look at tokenomics, look at algorithmic stablecoins that are designed to confuse regulators, because they will. So either we take the approach of having some plasticity, or the need for sophistication, or forcing these people to make clear definition. Because understanding a smart contract, understanding tokenomics is incredibly niche.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any follow-up thought on that question for those that guys?
We've gone down lots of different rabbit holes.
Yeah, we can go
There's
many,
no doubt
many
about it.
directions.
But I guess I would say I completely understand what Scott's saying. I think sometimes though, the way that regulators tend to approach these things, it could be like, I have to throw myself into this. I have to have the experts to support it. I will say that as a former regulator, the ability to actually attract the talent and the people who understand this in great detail, I do think this gets us back to some of the approaches to regulation. Are we talking about really setting a performance standard and performance goals and responsibilities and obligations and enforcement? Or are we talking about really having to get into the weeds on it? And there's going to be a balance. You have to have a baseline understanding of it, absolutely, and we've got to grow that that workforce across the board around technology too. But I think too there are. I think I go back to there are people obviously in the retail investment space who do understand the complexities and do understand the technology and do understand the capability. So treating everyone as one monolith here out in the world concerns me a bit. But we and I did some work at the CFPB on this, trying to start thinking about how do you segment disclosures? How do you make sure that you don't treat all consumers the same in terms of the way that you could provide disclosures? And I do think there's some opportunity here. Frankly, you get the next generation that expects it. The congressman mentioned his children saying to him, give all of this a chance. The next generation expects it. The government doesn't move fast enough for them. The government doesn't actually provide, the information that they think they want and the opportunities that they want. So how do we, start becoming a little more agile in the way we approach things is the other thing I would add to what Scott noted.
I would absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I think that's where we come back to looking at the structures and processes where companies conduct compliance with approved entities, take the weight off of the regulators, to put the trust in the market becomes very convincing. And I like the idea of the deposit insurance as well, because that also says that if you produce a certain amount of coin and release it to market, you need to have the collateral to handle any losses that occur. And so if you can't put up enough insurance to issue $10 million worth of coins. Well, you can only legally, register 1 million coins. And those sorts of things put the pressure on the market in the same way that we've had to do, as you exampled so very well, with the banking system. And I think these are the exciting solutions that ask the market to be responsible. And if you're not going to be responsible, and then you go to a different jurisdiction, then that jurisdiction gets a reputation for being a low trust jurisdiction. And then that's to an extent when the market forces take care of the problem.
Yeah, it seems like the main issue is that legislators and regulators signing these bills into law often don't really understand what they're signing, and it's our role here, the P3 network, to provide that leadership, so that trusted leadership, not just people out for their own personal interest, but producing the proper thoughts and ideas that they feel confident signing into law those legislation and recommendations that we provide.
There is because I've taken the view, I guess, of threat analyst. I'm very, very pro crypto. I'm very, very pro blockchain for the enormous amount of transformation it can do and hasn't yet realized in the full extent. But I think there's one thing that needs to be said about cryptocurrencies that they offer that the Swift networks, ACH, don't, is resilience. And we talk about this often in my area of the world, is that we haven't seen what we would call full spectrum warfare, which is the weaponization of basically every aspect of everything from the economy to technology to kinetic warfare. And the cyber capabilities at this point are no doubt capable of decimating the SWIFT system. We've seen Russia and China use information operations, disinformation. We've seen, Russia using, issues with food supply, gas supply, in order to coerce behavior. But the moment that we have a full spectrum cyber warfare, the SWIFT network would be the first thing that would come under attack. And what we saw in Venezuela when they had the power blackouts was very interesting because of the use of Bitcoin down there. People use mesh networks to continue to connect to the nodes. So when you look at the cryptocurrencies can function as a decentralized entity, they are in fact a resilient monetary network, which potentially even in developing economies or economies that experience chronic hyperinflation, that these cryptocurrencies can perform an enormous, powerful social role as a secondary economy that ultimately is resilient and enables people to continue to transact. It's a worst case scenario, but it's a very valid reason in a hostile multipolar world to look at a decentralized network.
Yeah, and that's the main goal, is to create stability in these regions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
And the confidence of their people. I mean, you get a lot of different dimensions here. But and Scott, I didn't take you as I figured you were here in large part because you are a believer, but always good for us to exercise the conversation and talk about the risks and being fully transparent. So
appreciate it and thrilled at the insights that Jeremy and yourself have shared, and the thinking that it's certainly spurred. Incredibly welcomed, and the take that you have from consumer protection and looking after the people.
Thank you, Kathy, Scott, and Jeremy. And I will also pass on my thanks to Congressman Sessions again for his support today. Everyone's insights were and are invaluable, especially relevant to the goals of Crypto Technology Advisory Group. I give thanks to the audience for being part of the inaugural event. We have lots of exciting things coming up, bridging the gap between the blockchain community and government stakeholders. We host in-person roundtables and stage virtual content with government leaders and private industry around the world. So visit us at p3network.com to stay in touch. And finally, thank you to our team and sponsors again for making this happen. Stay tuned.